guys, Utterpop here. I keep seeing so many comments after I've reacted and analyzed and commentated, but fairly heavily in the forensic field, on two of LEMMiNO's, I gotta remember to say his name right. Two of LEMMiNO's videos, that being the Dyatlov Pass case mystery and the search for DB Cooper, and everybody, oh, pretty much everybody, I'm not even joking about that, literally everybody was telling me, you have to check out his Jack the Ripper video next. And I was kind of already looking into that because there is some interesting, forensic aspects to this, especially considering the fact that this is probably one of the most, if not the most, famous cold cases in the history of the entire world. I don't know about history of the entire world, but at least within the last bunch of centuries in which, society has become more industrialized, and especially as law enforcement and forensics has really started to be explored and expanded on and picked up. Now, this video is actually a little bit more recent. This was from almost a year ago, so this one is actually pretty recent, at least compared to the other two. The Dyatlov Pass case mystery may have been the oldest one, and then the search for DB Cooper is a few years old, and then this one is right around a year old, give or take. I'm actually really happy to be watching this and tackling this, because this is actually something I do know a little bit about. I don't know quite all the specifics necessarily, but I am very familiar with some of the elements of this, because, come on, Jack the Ripper is such a fascinating serial killer to look at. For all we know, he could have had as few as 5 victims, at least based on the evidence. There were certainly 5 victims that were indeed from Jack the Ripper, but he could have had as many as like 25 of them in this crazy killing spree, basically. Serial killer and all. But I'm really excited to be watching this, so let's go ahead. This video is an hour and 9 minutes long. Wow. For one of the most famous cold cases in recent centuries, the fact that this is a little over an hour long is very surprising. LEMMiNO better have some very interesting stuff. Let's go.
Just let me know.
Let me know. Events documented in this video may disturb some viewers. No graphic imagery will be shown. Okay. Semi-disappointing, but that's okay. Let me just quickly explain that. I say semi-disappointing because a lot of the images from this time period, at least to me, they are very fascinating to look at in terms of the serial killings and the brutal deaths of a lot of these women. It sounds ridiculous, and of course, they were still in their own way innocent victims that didn't deserve this. But photographic evidence of crimes like this, whether cold case or not, are really fascinating to analyze and look at. But I can understand that none of that will be shown in here. For one thing, that might really mess with some of LEMMiNO's monetization abilities. I'm sure that was probably a huge factor. There's still a lot of more information to cover that doesn't necessarily require graphic images or extremely graphic images to be shown necessarily. I can understand the balance. It's a little bit of a shame, because I do really like looking at and analyzing even some of the gruesome and graphic photos, at least when it comes to law enforcement and forensics. That's just kind of my personal fascination. There's a reason that I studied forensic science for my bachelor's degree in college. And yes, in case there are those who are not familiar with my reactions who did not know, I have a bachelor's in forensic science with a focus in crime scene investigation, so this stuff is right up my alley. Anyways. Ooh, I like the graphics that he's put together. This looks
in the late 19th century,
lovely.
The city of London was the largest in the world.
True.
A sprawling metropolis and a melting pot for trade, finance, and people.
Mm-hmm.
But in the autumn of 1888, an horrific story emerged from the capital's East End.
Mm-hmm.
A story so dreadful, it sent shockwaves around the world. One after another, destitute women of the East End fell victim to a vicious killer known as Jack the Ripper.
Okay, this is kind of a quick interjection, and not necessarily relevant to forensics in any way. But this entire shot that is panning across, and all of these animations and movements, and just the general style of it, and the panoramic, I guess the panoramic aspect is part of the style as well. That is really cool. Did LEMMiNO find that or somehow put that together himself? Either way, there was a lot of this that he probably did either on his own, maybe with a little bit of help from somebody else. I'm not entirely sure. I know that he does a lot of his own animations, cuts, edits, text, research. I know he does pretty much all of that on his own, similar to Oversimplified, actually. I don't know how much of this panoramic shot he did on his own in terms of the drawing and the animations and whatnot, but it's really cool. I'm loving the aesthetic he is already starting to go with this video. Again, not related to forensics, but I wanted to put that in there because that kind of stuff is still very important to all manner of storytelling, especially when it's stuff kind of like this that people might not find quite as interesting or that people might be disturbed by.
One after another, destitute women of the East End fell victim to a vicious killer known as Jack the Ripper. Despite an extensive manhunt and a few close calls, the Ripper was never caught.
Nope.
Instead, the murders came to an abrupt end and left behind one of the greatest mysteries in the annals of crime.
True. It really is an enduring mystery. I love that font and how it appeared on screen. Almost beyond belief. Yeah.
In the East End of
Alright.
London, there's a district known as Whitechapel.
Mhm.
In the late 19th century, Whitechapel was known for its overcrowded slums, where many of the capital's poor and unemployed had taken refuge. Day and night, an army of policemen would constantly patrol this labyrinthine network of dim-lit streets, courts, and alleys. One such place was a narrow passage known as George Yard. Near the north entrance of this passage was a residential complex known as George Yard Buildings. It was the morning of August the 7th, 1888, when an upstairs tenant named John Reeves headed out for work. Upon reaching the first floor landing, Reeves encountered the body of a woman lying upon her back in a pool of blood.
What a sight to wake up
Horrified
to.
by the sight, he stumbled down to the street below
All times of the
in
video
search for help.
perhaps.
Constable Thomas Barrett was the first officer on the scene. He was soon joined by Dr. Timothy Killeen, who conducted a brief examination. The woman had been stabbed 39 times, primarily in the chest and abdomen.
Yep.
Dr. Killeen estimated that she had been dead for, quote, about 3 hours, thus placing the time of death at approximately 2:30 in the morning.
Which does make sense. If this guy just came down and there was a body very openly on the streets, one would only assume that it had been there at least since well after the night, the sort of night, and I guess in a way the nightlife had ended. Although in this area, I'm not really sure how much of a nightlife there could be. Even if there are poor individuals, there are still plenty of, prostitutes and whatnot. This estimation of a time of death, there's a science behind it. There is absolutely a science behind it. And even back in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, there were, I wouldn't say that there was plenty of research, but there was enough data and experimentation that was done to give a good indication of being able to estimate post-mortem. But no, it is a very fascinating subfield, not just of forensics, but of science in general, known as taphonomy, which is the study of decomposition. I actually have made a video about it. That video is a few years old. That video is from when I was first starting to make videos, so the camera is bad and the editing is bad, but a lot of the information still stands. Hi, Mama. I hear you grunting. The study of decomposition is relatively well known and pretty thorough, especially for forensic investigations. I won't go into too much detail, but I can say for certain that it is certainly possible to estimate time of death based on the appearance of the body. The first 48 hours in particular are very crucial And you can usually, within a reasonable range, estimate a time of death by the hour, give or take. After 48 hours, usually it starts turning into day or half day estimations. And even once you start hitting about 3 weeks, then it usually turns into weekly estimations. But it is still definitely possible. And you don't even have to just look at it. You don't just have to look at the body necessarily. There are plenty of other signs of evidence as well. Insect activity is huge in terms of applications to decomposition and taphonomy. Entomology in general is a major application of decomposition because it plays such a big role in how living organisms decompose, especially if they're out in the open or if they're somewhere in nature. Even an individual who's trapped in their apartment with few openings may still have a few insects here and there. And usually one of the best ways to estimate time of death is to take as many, I'm gonna butcher this word, but it's just really hard to say as all, entomological evidence, typically in the form of either adult insects or larvae, which in this case would be maggots for flies and grubs for beetles, because some beetles will feast on human remains. Usually beetles won't appear until a lot later in the decomposition process, and when I say later, I mean 2 weeks plus, depending on the environment. A variety of flies will swarm to a body if it is available to them, and different kinds of flies have different life cycles. Even two fly species that are very similar, like, the green bottlefly and the blue bottlefly, most simply put, larvae can basically grow in increments known as instars. So typically, for a lot of flies at least, there's usually anywhere between about 3 and 6 instars is pretty common for most fly species out there. So they will be an egg. They will hatch from that egg into their first instar. They will then shed that and go into their second instar, third instar, so on and so forth, until eventually they pupate. And then you wait a little bit, and then they become adults. But here's the thing. There's so much more of a science to it. Because depending on the species, you are able to take known temperatures every hour, give or take, and you are able to put together all the math and all the equations together to get a rough estimate, and a pretty accurate rough estimate at that, which is kind of funny that I'm saying accurate and rough and estimate all in the same phrase. But you could get a reasonably accurate estimate with enough temperature data and knowledge of the fly species to almost maybe to the minute get an estimation on time of death from when the body was found, simply based on entomological activity. Every arthropod species out there, namely when I say arthropods, I am talking about flies and beetles, they do have different, like I said earlier, they do have different life cycles. They do have a different number of instars. Each one of those larvae, each one of those instars require different temperatures in order to grow. And even at the same temperature, some of them still take longer. There's a science to this. There is precision and science to this. It is truly fascinating. I know I went on a little bit of a tangent, but I just thought that it was really interesting to explore, given that this is the late 1880s, and that even knowledge of taphonomy and decomposition was still somewhat known at this time, and it was still used, not quite to the extent that it is today. It's all really fascinating stuff. These are some pretty dark topics that are going to be covered in this video, so I'm sure that my explanation probably was not as bad as some of what else could be discussed in this video.
About 3 hours, thus placing the time of death at approximately 2:30 in the morning. The woman had likely been attacked where she was found, as no blood was found beyond the staircase landing. But this was strange, as none of the tenants in this crowded building had heard a single cry for help or a disturbance of any kind. One exception was Amy Hewitt, a tenant who claimed to have heard a lone cry of murder. But this was early in the evening of August the 6th, and the scream had emanated from outside the complex. Hewitt further explained, "The district round here is rather rough, and cries of murder are a frequent, if not nightly occurrence." The victim was eventually identified as 39-year-old Martha Tabram. Tabram was a mother of two and had separated from her husband many years prior. Her last known address was 19 George Street, a common lodging house less than 300 meters from the site of her death.
Not at all far.
Tabram had made a living through prostitution, and one of her associates was a woman named Mary Ann Connolly. Connolly testified that on the evening of August the 6th, she and Tabram had been out drinking with two soldiers. Then, shortly before midnight, the party of four had separated. Connolly took her client into Angel Alley, while Tabram guided hers into neighboring George Yard. It was the last time she saw Tabram alive. Barely 2 hours later, Constable Barrett had spoken to a soldier loitering near the north entrance of George Yard. The soldier had told Barrett that he was, quote, waiting for his mate who had gone away with a girl. Half an hour later, Tabram is presumed to have died. Both Connolly and Barrett were called upon to identify the soldiers, but all those accused could provide an alibi. One had been at home with his wife, another at an army base, and yet another in a completely different part of the city. This was enough for Inspector Edmund Reed, the lead investigator on the case, to abandon this line of inquiry. Connolly and Barrett, having both picked out the wrong men, they could not be trusted again, as their evidence would be worthless.
Edmund Reed. I don't know if many of you have heard of him, but certainly I have heard his name many times across various forensics classes. I wouldn't say he's, one of the most famous, but he's definitely one of the more genuine that we probably learned about or kind of glossed over just a little bit. This guy, albeit pretty short, if I'm remembering correctly, compared to some of the other soldiers, some of the other policemen, this guy was practically at the top of his game. He was so good at policing, and then it did not take him too terribly long to become detective inspector. And that was before any of these Jack the Ripper serial killings first started happening. Forensics-wise, he's not very well known necessarily. In terms of law enforcement, though, he is. And he was one of the lead investigators for the Jack the Ripper serial killings. So his name is pretty well known. And, he was commended for his investigations because he tried. He and a lot of the other people in Scotland Yard, I think it was, they tried. They tried so hard. And they couldn't find anything.
They could not be trusted again, as their evidence would be worthless. Even if a soldier had been responsible, no one could deduce a motive. The people of Whitechapel might have been accustomed to crime and violence, but the sheer brutality of this attack was as frightening as it was confounding.
Mm-hmm.
The crime is one of the most brutal that have occurred for some years. For a poor, defenseless woman to be outraged and stabbed in such a manner is almost beyond belief. These were the concluding remarks delivered at the final inquest held on August the 23rd. Only a week later, things would go from bad to worse.
Almost beyond belief, hence the name of the chapter. Here we go. Not an atom of evidence.
On the morning of August the 31st, a man named Robert Paul left his home on Foster Street and headed for work. After making a right turn into Bucks Row, he spotted a man standing in the road. The man turned around to face him and said, "Come and look over here. There's a woman lying on the pavement." The stranger was named Charles Cross, and he too had been on his way to work when he first caught sight of the woman. The two men now cautiously approached. The woman's hands were cold to the touch, and Cross believed she was dead. Paul, however, thought he could sense faint breathing. But instead of seeking immediate help, Cross and Paul were more concerned about being late for work. As such, they quickly resumed their morning commute, hoping to notify policemen along the way. Fortunately, Constable John Neal was just around the corner. Neal was equipped with a lantern and found the woman lying on her back with a deep cut across the throat. The wound was still bleeding and parts of her body were still warm. He was soon joined by Constable John Thane, who was sent at once to fetch a nearby doctor. Upon his arrival, shortly after 4 o'clock, Dr. Reese Llewellyn estimated that, quote, she had not been dead more than half an hour. In other words, Cross and Paul had likely found the woman mere minutes after she was killed. Furthermore, 3 officers had patrolled the vicinity just a few minutes prior. Constable Neal had last inspected Bucks Row at approximately 3:15. So too had Sergeant Henry Kirby, whereas Constable Thane had merely passed the end of the street, none of whom had seen nor heard anything amiss. Upon the body's removal to the mortuary, a shocking discovery was made. Apart from 2 incisions in the throat, the woman had also been, quote, disemboweled. No organs had been removed, but Dr. Llewellyn found, quote, several incisions running across the abdomen. He also believed that the killer possessed, quote, some rough anatomical knowledge, for he seemed to have attacked all the vital parts.
And that's the thing, too, with a lot of the murders that were what people assume to be definitively attributed to Jack the Ripper, specifically 5 bodies. They may be the only ones, they may not be. But the examination of those 5 in particular did suggest that Jack the Ripper did have potentially an extensive knowledge of anatomy and human physiology. And the same could theoretically be true of these other women who were killed if they were indeed Jack the Ripper's victims as well. I will say, given the fact that I'm trying to remember some of the time frames because we're still in the late 1880s, but given the fact that the woman was disemboweled but nothing was removed and her throat was slashed twice, vital areas were hit, so he probably had some kind of anatomical knowledge. I do agree with that, absolutely. I think her name was Mary Ann something. If there was a significant amount of time between this murder and her murder, I'm not entirely sure how much I buy this being a Jack the Ripper killing. Based on at least the 5 victims that people are certain are Jack the Ripper victims, there are suggestions of extensive anatomical knowledge. But this particular victim was not disemboweled, or she was disemboweled, but nothing was actually removed. I suppose the only thing would be that if this woman right here was indeed a Jack the Ripper victim, then he could have just been trying to experiment, trying to get a feel for, his tell as a serial killer, and then became more apparent and obvious and gruesome with later victims. But we don't know for sure, of course. I mean, the nature of the similarities suggests that these 2 women still could have been Jack the Ripper, and he just hadn't created his signature yet. But we don't know.
For he seemed to have attacked all the vital parts. The victim was quickly identified. Her name was Mary Ann Nichols, and she had turned 43 just 5 days before the murder.
This is what I was talking about.
Nichols had at least 6 children,
Mary Ann Nichols.
and her last known address was a common lodging house at 56 Flower and Dean Street.
Wait, I thought she...
On the night of her death, Nichols had been turned away from a lodging house on Thrall Street as she lacked the funds to pay for a bed. Seeking to raise the money through prostitution, Nichols had then ventured down Osborne Street before meeting her friend, Ellen Holland. The 2 of them shared a brief exchange, but Nichols was visibly drunk. When they parted ways around 2:30, Holland saw Nichols staggering eastward along Whitechapel Road. Barely an hour later, she was found dead.
I don't fully remember that. I thought Marianne I thought some of her internal organs were removed. Okay, that does change things just a slight bit. So Because Marianne is attributed to being, I'm trying to remember the general title, like one of the determined five that researchers are sure are Jack the Ripper killings, or victims, I mean. And Marianne is cited to be the first one. If her organs were not removed, then, and it was almost definitively attributed to Jack the Ripper, then A, it could have been a rushed job, or B, he simply hadn't fully developed his signature yet. Okay. I should have let it play just a little bit longer, then I would have realized that it was freaking Marianne. Like I said, I knew a little bit about this. I didn't know plenty of the specifics. LEMMiNO was killing it with all these times and these animations. This is very well animated and edited, and especially to use such a huge, massive, encompassing map like this is crazy. I absolutely commend him for it. Okay, so we are definitely talking about the first of the five. The previous one, was it Martha Tabram, I think? That name sounded vaguely familiar, but I didn't know too much about her, but I knew that she was not... I didn't recognize the name fully, so I knew she wasn't one of the five.
Barely an hour later, she was found dead. Apart from the body itself, the killer had left nothing in their wake. No blood trail, no murder weapon, no witnesses. Inspector Joseph Helson, the lead investigator on the case, stated that, quote, "Not an atom of evidence can be obtained to connect any person with the crime."
Yep.
While the Nichols case ground to a screeching halt, its similarities with the Martha Tabram case had not gone unnoticed. In both cases, the attack had been needlessly ferocious, and there was no discernible motive. Both victims were prostitutes of roughly the same age and moved in the same circles. The only meaningful difference was their injuries. Tabram had been repeatedly stabbed, whereas Nichols had suffered multiple slash wounds. Differences aside, the prevailing assumption was that the same deranged individual had committed both murders, a conviction that would only grow stronger in the days that followed.
Liking this background audio. Oh, he's got a consistent map of. He edited this very nicely.
As the sun was rising on September the 8th, a man named John Richardson was on his way to work. At 4:45, he made a quick stop at 29 Hanbury Street. He went through the entrance and out the back door by way of a cramped hallway. Richardson then sat down on the backyard steps before grabbing a knife to trim a vexing piece of leather from his boot. Once satisfied, he left the building and shut the front door behind him. About an hour later, a third-floor tenant of the same address, John Davis, plodded downstairs and into the hallway. The front door was now wide open, but the one in the back was closed. When Davis went to open it, he found the bloodied remains of a woman lying on her back just below the steps. Inspector Joseph Chandler was the first officer on the scene. After a brief inspection, he sent at once for a medic. Dr. George Phillips arrived at 6:30 and found the woman, quote, "terribly mutilated." The throat had been, quote, "dissevered deeply," whereas the abdomen had been, quote, "entirely laid open." The intestines had been, quote, "lifted out of the body and placed by the shoulder of the corpse."
Throat dissevered deeply. Is this the woman whose head was almost decapitated from her body? Because I think I remember that one or two of because I think it was one or two of the determined five who had enough slash wounds on their neck that almost ended up leaving them decapitated entirely. I don't know if it was one or two, and I don't know if it's this one or not. I don't remember the order of the victims. I just kind of remember little bits and pieces. I don't really remember names either. I'm not really good with names. If I saw the name though, I'd be like, yes, that is definitely there. The intestines being lifted out of the body and placed deliberately somewhere. Whenever I see something like that, I always think some kind of spiritual reason or some kind of, I can't really think of the term, but some kind of spiritual reason or meaning behind placing something like that in such an odd place. That's the first thought that comes to my mind. Or it could be a part of, like, a new part of a signature that he was experimenting with. I'm not entirely sure, but it is still very interesting, the fact that it wasn't just lifted out and kind of placed somewhere messily, or wasn't even taken and it's considered missing. It flat out was taken out and placed somewhere that wasn't even close to where it should have belonged. But if based on my reading of this, there was the possibility that it was placed deliberately, it's kind of something to think about. He could still be just experimenting with the signature, assuming that this is one of Jack the Ripper's victims, or one of the 5 at least.
The intestines had been, quote, lifted out of the body and placed by the shoulder of the corpse. The body was then conveyed to the mortuary, while Inspector Chandler and Dr. Phillips conducted a sweep of the backyard. Most of what they found belonged to the tenants of the building, but just below the resting place of the woman's feet, they found a small piece of cloth and 2 combs. The items had likely belonged to the victim, but it seemed to Dr. Phillips that they had been deliberately positioned and arranged by the killer. The post-mortem revealed that 2 brass rings had been forcefully removed from the victim's left hand. These rings were nowhere to be found. Portions of the victim's abdomen had also gone missing, including the womb. Dr. Phillips believed that, quote, the mode in which these portions were extracted showed some anatomical knowledge. This point was greatly expanded upon at a subsequent inquest. The injuries had been made by someone who had considerable anatomical skill and knowledge. There were no meaningless cuts. For instance, no mere slaughterer of animals could have carried out these operations. It must have been someone accustomed to the post-mortem room.
Mm-hmm. There are plenty
The victim was quickly identified as Annie Chapman.
Yes.
Chapman's date of birth is a bit uncertain, but she was roughly 47 at the time of her death. She had at least 7 children, but was tragically only survived by 2.
Yeah.
Her last known address was a common lodging house at 35 Dorset Street. On the night of her death, Chapman had been denied accommodations as she lacked the funds to pay for a bed. She was escorted off the premises by the night watchman, who then saw her vanish into a nearby alleyway. What happened to Chapman over the next few hours, nobody knows. Her whereabouts during this time is a complete mystery. But unlike the 2 previous cases, a witness in the Chapman case might have caught a glimpse of the killer. At 5:30 on the morning of September the 8th, a woman named Elizabeth Long spotted a man and a woman conversing outside 29 Hanbury Street. Long was positive that the woman she'd seen was Annie Chapman, but the man had stood with his back towards Long, so she never saw his face. Long did, however, manage to overhear a fragment of their conversation. The man had posed the question, "Will you?" to which the woman responded, "Yes." Now, a lasting point of contention in the Chapman case is the time of death. According to Dr. Phillips, when he arrived at 6:30, Chapman had been dead for, quote, at least 2 hours. That would place her death at around 4:30. But according to Long, she saw Chapman alive a full hour later. Then there's the testimony of John Richardson. Richardson was the son of one of the tenants in the building. At 4:45, he made a routine checkup on the door to the basement, which had previously suffered a break-in. When he found it secure, he sat down on the backyard steps to trim a piece of leather from his boot. Even though he sat mere centimeters from the murder site, Richardson did not see a body. He was adamant on this point. I could not have failed to notice the deceased if she had been there. To muddle the timeline even further, there's the testimony of Albert Kadosh. About 20 minutes past 5, Kadosh had gone through the backyard of 27 Hanbury Street when he heard voices coming from nearby. They were barely audible, however, and Kadosh had only made out the word no. A few minutes later, he heard something falling against the wooden fence dividing the 2 yards. There's no one way to untangle this web of contradictions, but Dr. Phillips did concede the possibility that he'd miscalculated. That, quote, the coldness of the morning and the great loss of blood had skewed his opinion, which was largely based on the warmth of the body. So, presuming that Dr. Phillips did miscalculate, and the recollections of Long and Kadosh were off by a few minutes, that would place Chapman's death at around 5:30 in the morning. By this point, the dim light of dawn would have provided the tenants of 29 Hanbury Street an unobstructed view of the murder site, some of whom had even slept with their windows open. In spite of this, the killer managed to evade detection and even made time to arrange the victim's possessions.
Crazy. The warmth of the body being the primary means of estimating time of death post-mortem. Taphonomy is not a perfect science necessarily. In fact, most of forensics is not really a perfect science. A lot of it is speculation and estimation and subjective and objective opinion based on experience, based on what is known about nature, about physics, chemistry, geology, geography, taphonomy, animal activity, zoology. It is a combination of needing to know so many things. So I didn't realize, maybe I had some of my timelines off. That forensics and taphonomy, well, not taphonomy, but forensics in general, didn't really start getting experimented with and expanded on until I want to say the early to mid 1900s. And this is, the late 1880s. So naturally, it's definitely not going to be a perfect science, taphonomy, in terms of what coroners look at in regards to time of death and postmortem timeframes. For all we know, the doctor could have been right in his estimate, and everybody else's testimony just happened to be something else. Or the doctor's estimate could have been a little off, as he apparently admitted to, which, good on you, good sir, because forensics and science and even anatomy, even for coroners who probably just work at that time period, probably just work with deceased individuals, even they can't get everything right. It's not a perfect science.
As the tally of victims gradually mounted, the public grew increasingly anxious. They were not only frightened by the murders, but frustrated with the police and their perceived incompetence. Even across the pond were the efforts of the police fiercely criticized. The London police and detective force is probably the stupidest in the world. What these mocking quotes and illustrations failed to capture were the overwhelming odds stacked in favor of the perpetrator. The police were up against someone who seemingly struck without motive, someone who left no murder weapon and few witnesses. On top of that, the East End was severely overcrowded, while the police were understaffed. As one newspaper put it, "A man in the East End of London is a grain of sand, as invisible and almost as much beyond identification amid the masses." At no point would this become more apparent than during the events of September the 30th.
Here we go. The double event. Yep. Let's go.
On September the 29th, a routine Saturday meeting was held at the Socialist Club on Berners Street. When the meeting came to a close around midnight, all but a few members returned home. Those who remained proceeded to drink and socialize. Half an hour in September the 30th, Joseph Lave stepped outside to get some fresh air. Lave used the side entrance leading into Dutville's yard and lingered for about 10 minutes. Moments after Lave got back inside, Morris Eagle accessed the building via the same entrance. He too was a member of the club and had just returned after escorting a woman home. Neither of them noticed anything unusual. 20 minutes later, the sound of a horse and carriage could be heard trotting down Burner Street. The driver was Louis Diemschutz, the steward of the clubhouse. When Diemschutz drove into Dutville's yard, his pony abruptly veered to the left. When he looked down to his right, he thought he could discern something in the darkness. Diemschutz stepped down from his barrow and after lighting a match, could see a woman lying on her side against the wall. Without even knowing if she was, quote, drunk or dead, Diemschutz rushed inside the club to check on his wife. When he found her safe and sound, he alerted the other members and a small crowd soon gathered outside. They could now see that the woman's throat had been, quote, fearfully cut, and that, quote, a stream of blood was trickling down the yard. Eagle, Diemschutz, and a few others promptly dispersed to find a policeman. While a growing crowd of bystanders waited for authorities to arrive, there was no sign of the perpetrator.
Should we let it trace?
But across the city, less than a kilometer to the west, an even more ghoulish discovery was about to be made. At 1:30 of the same morning, Constable Edward Watkins patrolled an open space known as Mitre Square. Watkins' beat would take him through the square about once every 13 minutes, and on this occasion, it was deserted. But in the time it took Watkins to complete another rotation, Mitre Square was turned into a crime scene. I next came in at 1:44. I turned to the right. I saw the body of a woman lying there on her back. I saw her throat was cut and her bowels protruding. The stomach was ripped up. She was lying in a pool of blood.
The double event. Yep.
Dr. George Cicada and Dr. Frederick Brown soon converged upon the scene. They found terrible injuries inflicted upon the woman's face, throat, and abdomen. The intestines had been, quote, drawn out to a large extent and placed over the right shoulder. Among the many lacerations to the face, Dr. Brown noted that, quote, the lobe and auricle of the right ear was cut obliquely through. Based on their expert opinions, coupled with the testimony of Watkins, the woman had died within minutes of her body being found.
Based on the patrol route, it makes sense.
Back in Burner Street, Dr. Frederick Blackwell and Dr. George Phillips had reached the same conclusion. The woman in Dutville's yard had died within minutes of her body being found. But unlike previous victims, she had only suffered injuries to the throat. There were no abdominal mutilations or anything else by which to connect the attack to the others. But the murder in Dutville's yard and the one in Mitre Square were separated by less than 1 kilometer and some 45 minutes. This allowed for a chilling possibility. It was suspected then, as it continues to be today, that when Diemschutz came clattering through the gateway, he unwittingly interrupted the murder. The killer may even have become trapped inside Dutville's yard because the gate on Burner Street was the only point of entry. Perhaps they saw an opportunity to escape when Diemschutz then rushed inside the club. From there, it would have taken them less than 15 minutes to reach Mitre Square. Plenty of time to hunt for another victim. But it must be emphasized that this is pure speculation. There is no evidence to suggest the two murders were even connected.
Given the similarities, it is possible.
The woman in Dutville's yard was identified as 44-year-old Elizabeth Stride. Stride was a Swedish immigrant who'd lived in London for over 2 decades.
Gustav's daughter?
Following the death of her husband, she had made a living through prostitution. Her last known address was a common lodging house at 32 Flower and Dean Street. On the night of her death, Stride had been seen by quite an abundance of witnesses. First, she was seen in the company of a, quote, respectably dressed man around 11 o'clock. About 1:15 to midnight, Stride was seen talking to a man who was, quote, decently dressed and had the appearance of a clerk. Then, Only a few minutes before the murder, Stride was seen in the company of a man by Constable William Smith. The man was carrying a small parcel wrapped in newspaper and was of, quote, respectable appearance. It's unclear whether these descriptions are of the same person or if Stride accosted multiple clients as the night progressed.
Either possible.
There were other witnesses, some less credible than others, but the one that really stood out from the rest was Israel Schwartz. About 1:45, Schwartz had been walking down Burner Street. As he came up on Duttville's yard, he witnessed a man throwing a woman to the ground in front of the entrance. The woman had, quote, screamed 3 times, but not very loudly. Schwartz would later identify this woman as Elizabeth Stride. Schwartz did not try to intervene, but opted instead to simply cross the street. That's when he spied a second man on the opposite side who was lighting a pipe. The man who attacked the woman then appeared to address the second man by shouting the name Lipsky. The pipe smoker then proceeded to follow Schwartz before eventually breaking away. When taken at face value, this story appears to suggest that the killer had an accomplice by the name of Lipsky. This was indeed the interpretation of some government officials. But Inspector Frederick Abeline, one of the lead investigators on the case, had a very different interpretation. You see, the name Lipsky had gained notoriety in 1887 when a Jewish man by the name of Israel Lipsky was convicted of murder. Owing to the publicity of that case, the surname Lipsky had become an anti-Semitic slur. Abeline therefore deduced that the man who shouted Lipsky was directing an insult at Schwartz, who was described as having a, quote, strong Jewish appearance. The man with the pipe, meanwhile, may have been an innocent passerby who became frightened along with Schwartz. Whether Abeline's interpretation is correct, it's doubtful we'll ever truly know.
It makes sense, though.
Nevertheless,
It is possible.
Schwartz's account is compelling, as he conceivably witnessed the moment when Elizabeth Stride was attacked. Back in Mitre Square, a large crowd of spectators had assembled upon the scene,
Shocker.
all driven by their morbid curiosity to get a glimpse of the body.
True.
The post-mortem revealed that the killer had extracted a few organs, including the womb and left kidney. According to Dr. Brown, this extraction required, quote, a good deal of knowledge, which he likened to that of a butcher. By contrast, Dr. Cicada did not find any signs of, quote, great anatomical skill. The woman in Mitre Square was identified as 46-year-old Catherine Eddowes.
Yep.
Eddowes had at least 5 children, but after escaping her abusive husband, she had become estranged from her family. Her last known address was a common lodging house at 55 Flower and Dean Street. On the night of her death, Eddowes had been out drinking. She got so drunk that around 8:30, she was found lying on the sidewalk in Aldgate High Street, surrounded by a crowd. The commotion attracted a few officers, who then escorted Eddowes to a nearby police station. There, she remained locked in a cell until 1 o'clock in the morning. After being released from jail, Eddowes was likely spotted in the company of a man in the vicinity of Mitre Square. Only one of the 3 witnesses, Joseph Lavende, had paid close attention to the couple. The man had the appearance of a sailor and wore a, quote, reddish handkerchief round his neck. While Lavende did identify the woman as Catherine Eddowes, he never saw her face. Nevertheless, this sighting was only made some 10 minutes before Eddowes' body was discovered by Constable Watkins. What's so incredibly tragic about the Eddowes case is how narrowly the killer escaped justice. First of all, the only private residence in Mitre Square was occupied by a policeman and his family. They had slept right next to an upper floor window overlooking the murder site. Second of all, a night watchman and retired policeman had been cleaning a warehouse within earshot of the murder site.
Jeez.
He would routinely hear the footsteps of patrolling officers, yet heard nothing at the time of the murder. Finally, Constable James Harvey had glanced into Mitre Square at roughly 20 minutes to 2. That's right in between the sighting by Lavende and the body's discovery. Harvey should have had an unobstructed view of the murder site, yet he failed to notice anything suspicious. Was it too dark? Was the killer standing just a few meters away, cloaked in shadow?
Crazy.
Did one or more witnesses get the time wrong?
I knew one of them was very close in terms of
While the
getting
killer
caught.
did ultimately escape, they did not do so without leaving a trace. Shortly before 3 o'clock, a blood-stained piece of cloth was found near the entrance to a building a few blocks to the northeast. It proved to be a ripped portion of the apron worn by Eddowes. The patch had evidently been torn off and then discarded by the killer upon their escape. Now, on the wall above this patch of apron, someone had written a message. "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing."
Yep,
To
that's
this
right.
day, both the meaning and the author of this message remain in doubt. Was it written by the killer?
Yep.
Was it an attempt to cast suspicion upon or even away from the Jewish community? Was it completely unrelated to the murder? Similar questions would soon be raised by a few letters. Letters which had supposedly
letters.
been written and posted by the killer.
Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Yep. Here we go. The letters.
3 days before the murder of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, the Central News Agency of London received a letter in the post, the author of which claimed responsibility for the recent murders and to be planning for the quote, "next job." Then, in the aftermath of the 2 killings, the same agency received a blood-smeared postcard. It contained details about the atrocities, which the author described as a quote, "double event." On the off chance that the letters were genuine, the police decided to make them public. The hope was that someone would recognize the handwriting. Unfortunately, no one ever did.
Nope.
Instead, it merely served to advertise the name with which the letters had been signed. Opinions on the letters' authenticity were divided back then and continue to be today. Most notably, the Dear Boss letter had promised to quote, "clip the lady's ears off" and send them to the police. The police never received such a package, and neither of the 2 victims had had their ears removed. But you may recall that the right earlobe of Eddowes had been quote, "cut obliquely through." Was this a botched attempt by the killer to keep their promise? Or was it merely one of numerous lacerations with no connection to the letter? The contents of the letters notwithstanding, modern linguistic analysis does suggest that they were penned by the same hand. So, hoaxes or not, the authors were likely one and the same.
Forensic linguistics is a really interesting subfield. I studied this a little bit myself not just when I was in college, but even a little bit in high school as well. I want to say it was actually my first semester in college where we did a little bit of a study on this. My first or my second semester in college, where one of my basic crime scene investigation classes did do a little bit of a segment of class on forensic linguistics and gas chromatography. Now, the focus was a little bit, funny enough, the focus was a little bit less on the gas chromatography aspect, which is kind of more the science aspect, and more on the subjective analysis of linguistics and language. In other words, examining somebody's handwriting, examining the speech and the vocabulary used, and comparing them to one another. It's really interesting stuff. So I want to say it's every 5 to 7 years that your handwriting undergoes extreme changes. Everybody's handwriting is changing slowly but surely over time. There are certain aspects of my handwriting that I've certainly changed in recent years. I used to do W's certain ways for like a year or 2, and then I stopped doing that, but short term, my handwriting did change. And everybody's does. But everybody's handwriting is most notably different every 5 to 7 years. In some cases, you can still tell if it's the same person, especially if they're more adult individuals who, once you kind of hit some of the adult years, it's more that your handwriting will change, but your speech and your vocabulary won't change quite too much. And that's a lot of what linguistics focuses on, at least in terms of that specific subfield of forensics. So I mean, if these are like sort of images of, or like, you know, generalized images of what these actually look like, obviously the fonts are very different, but if an analysis of a lot of the speech used can be compared and can be very similar, you can still identify it as it potentially belonging to the same individual, which is very possibly what happened, depending on the font and the style of the lettering itself. If it was relatively similar and they had the speech to analyze, that's one thing. And that would make it almost something of a no-brainer. You don't want to jump to conclusions, but certainly there's a lot of strong evidence pointing to that. If the fonts and the lettering were a little bit different, that could still potentially be chalked up to somebody is intentionally screwing up their own handwriting or changing their handwriting, but still using the same words, the same speech, the same tone, I guess you could say, because you can express tone in written form. It is possible. Just look at all the fiction out there. But yeah, forensic linguistics is really interesting stuff. I do kind of wish I would have explored it just a little bit more, but I was still trying to get used to college, and I eventually was going to be super into entomology, so moving on.
So, hoaxes or not, the authors were likely one and the same. However, the handwriting bore, quote, no resemblance at all to the message written above the torn patch of apron.
Not the actual handwriting. Good
Now,
clarification.
the publication of the letters inspired an onslaught of copycats. Agencies all over London were soon inundated with correspondence imitating the other two. But at least one of them might have been genuine, not because of the contents of the letter, but rather the contents of a box with which it was delivered. On October the 16th, a man named George Lusk received a small package in the post.
That's right.
Lusk was the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, a small group of local tradesmen who sought to identify the killer. The package consisted of a letter and a cardboard box containing half a kidney. The doctors who examined the kidney all agreed that it was human, but whether it was the same left kidney removed from the body of Eddowes could not be determined. It could, for instance, have been an elaborate hoax by a medical student or someone with access to human organs. The author of the accompanying letter, meanwhile, insisted that the kidney did belong to the victim and that they had fried and eaten the other half.
If only DNA evidence was a thing back in the 1880s, but I suppose if it was, this might not have even happened at all. DNA evidence would have confirmed pretty readily if that kidney portion belonged to Eddowes or not. That is certainly something that is unfortunate. Now, I will say, DNA analysis and acquisition, even that's not necessarily perfect. There can still be problems with the acquisition of the DNA or the subsequent analysis of it. It could be contaminated. There could be multiple blood samples that may be difficult to discern a little bit, although it is possible to differentiate between multiple blood sources in the same sample, depending on how many there are. If it's up to 3, maybe 4, you might be able to discern them. Once you start getting into the 5 and above, especially once you start getting into the 10 and above, that's when it starts to become impossible. Although I didn't study too much on DNA analysis, because again, my focus was on crime scene investigation. It was not in forensic biochemistry. I did do some lab portions for forensics classes, but I didn't do much. Most of what I was studying pertained to the sheer crazy variety of other forensic subfields and the field work. The crime scene investigation, decomposition, some anatomy, but entomology, forensic photography, bloodstain analysis, but things like DNA analysis, toxicology, gas chromatography, we maybe got bare introductions at best, because that was not our focus. There's the crime scene investigation route that you could take in the program, or the forensic biochemistry. So even DNA analysis is not necessarily perfect, but it is without question, one of the most surefire ways to get more conclusive evidence in terms of forensic investigations. And if that existed in this time period, that at least would have confirmed if that kidney did belong to Edo's or not. But that evidence, no matter what it was, is from over a century ago. It's from practically 125 years ago. More than that, really. There's nothing that can be done at this point. If you think about it, this guy committed all these crimes in the prime of times, in a sense. There were still so many aspects of technology and even weaponry, and science was kind of slowly but surely taking off in a variety of fields, but there was still not enough known about it, and there wasn't quite the technology that we have today in order to better investigate, to better measure and analyze. Different time periods, very different time periods.
A popular theory at the time, and one that still is today, was that some of the letters had been fabricated by the press. According to Chief Inspector John Littlechild, the letters were, quote, a smart piece of journalistic work. Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson dismissed the letters as, quote, the creation of an enterprising London journalist. Meanwhile, Chief Constable Melville McNaughton thought he could discern the, quote, stained forefinger of the journalist.
A lot of people think also that fingerprint analysis is very surefire. Yes and no, because everybody does have their own unique fingerprints. I have 10 unique fingerprints that nobody else in the world does. Even twins, or triplets, or quadruplets, or whatever, however many numbers there are, even they don't have the same fingerprints. Any identical twins or triplets will have the same DNA, but they won't have the same fingerprints. But fingerprint acquisition is even more iffy than DNA acquisition. Most of the prints you might gather from a crime scene won't even be viable for comparison. I love using this example all the time. It was my final year at college, and we were assigned into crime scene investigation units. Every single one of us had our jobs. I was the fingerprint analyzer and, fingerprint lifter and analyzer for my team. I was basically given all the objects. I used a variety of techniques to try and locate prints. Then I had to lift them, or attempt to lift them, and then I had to analyze and compare them to the best of my ability. And then create a presentation that I presented in a mock trial courtroom led by law students. Yeah, that was, it's no joke, the mock stuff that they do for you in that program. Aha, I knew I still had that PowerPoint that I used in that class, which I, again, presented to both my fellow colleagues as well as law students. Over the course of my analysis, I lifted in total 14 prints, 13 of which I analyzed closely. One print did not possess any detail for me to use a proper analysis. From a single item, I lifted 6 prints. One was a source identification in which it was full enough and there were enough second level detail markers that I was able to properly compare it with another print and make what is known in our business as a source identification. The second was a potential source identification, so it was likely more of a partial print, if I'm remembering some of this wording correctly. The other 4 were irrelevant or inconclusive. I wasn't able to gather enough data to know for sure. I lifted 2 prints from another object. It looked like it was only a partial. It shared characteristics with 8 other known prints. So in other words, I was given, I think I saw it was 8 different print cards with 10 different fingerprints each. And one of those prints shared characteristics with 8 of the other prints, and I couldn't narrow it down any further, so therefore the results were largely inconclusive. While the second print was a potential source identification. Potential. There's a difference between a source identification and a potential source identification. Basically, I guess you could think of source identification as highly likely and potential as somewhat likely. 6 prints were lifted off of this. One of them was a source identification, according to my notes. 2 of them were potential source identifications. And the other 3 were inconclusive, 2 of which due to overlapping prints. So in other words, I was able to make 2 positive source identifications and 3 potential source identifications, which out of 14, that's 5. That's less than half. Less than half the prints were viable for analysis. Well, technically most of them were viable for analysis, but the results were inconclusive. There wasn't enough information, there wasn't enough detail. Fingerprinting is not easy. It's honestly kind of more an art than a science. Even though we have unique fingerprints, you may leave your prints all over the place. But it's not like you're just gonna slap it on your desk just perfectly, hold it for a couple of seconds, and then boom, fingerprint powder. No, that's not how it works. Not to mention that every surface is very different. I mean, blood, no matter what kind of surface you find it on, there are some exceptions, you can get a reasonable DNA sequence from it to analyze. Fingerprints, not so much. Even though every single individual in the world has 10 totally unique fingerprints that are different from any of their other prints or anybody else's fingerprints of the 7+ billion people in the world. Fingerprinting, if only it were easier, but unfortunately, it is not. Not like those crime shows make you think it is. It is not.
There are a few candidates for who this journalist might have been, but there is no solid evidence against any one of them.
No, there's not.
Whether it was a hoax by an enterprising journalist or the genuine prose of the Ripper, the letters did nonetheless receive widespread attention.
They
They
did.
commanded space in virtually every newspaper and dominated much of the public discourse throughout October, a month which passed without a single atrocity bearing the signature marks of Jack the Ripper. Perhaps it was finally over. It is pretty certain that the master has become frightened and has suspended his horrible work for the present, if not for good.
If only. The work of a devil. Accurate chapter title.
On the morning of November the 9th, a merchant and property owner named John McCarthy was going through his bookkeeping. McCarthy was the landlord of Miller's Court, and the tenants of room 13 had fallen behind on their rent. McCarthy sent at once for his assistant, Thomas Boyer, to collect the money at 11:15. After knocking twice without response, Boyer went around the corner to peer through a window, but his view was obstructed by a coat or curtain, so Boyer had to reach through a broken window pane to pull it aside. That's when he saw the severely mutilated body of a woman lying upon a bed in the corner of the room.
Yep.
Miller's Court was soon crawling with police, but the door to room 13 was locked and had to be forced open with a pickaxe. What they found inside was truly the stuff of nightmares. The sight we saw, I cannot drive away from my mind. It looked more like the work of a devil than of a man. The whole scene is more than I can describe. I hope I may never see such a sight again. Dr. George Phillips described the body as, quote, cut all to pieces. Dr. Thomas Bond described the woman's face as, quote, hacked beyond recognition. The abdomen had been, quote, emptied of its viscera, while the throat had been, quote, severed all round, down to the bone. The body had been monstrously disfigured, with loose organs dispersed all around it. The room itself was sparsely furnished and offered little in the way of clues. 2 tables, 1 or 2 chairs, and a small cabinet. Amongst the ashes of a fireplace, the police found patches of burned clothing. Had the killer tried to dispose of evidence, or had it merely been used for warmth and light? The victim was identified almost immediately. Her name was Mary Jane Kelly, and she was the tenant of 13 Miller's Court. But nearly everything about Kelly's life is shrouded in mystery. She was presumably of Welsh or Irish descent, and in her mid-20s, making her the youngest victim by far. But given that no matching records of a
around their
Mary Jane
40s
Kelly
or
have
even
been found,
30s.
it's probable that she was using a fake identity. In any case, Kelly had not been living alone. Up until a few days before the murder, she had cohabited with a man named Joseph Barnett. They had only separated on October the 30th because Barnett disapproved of Kelly's prostitution and the people with whom she associated.
Shocker there.
But they did see each other again. On the evening of November the 8th, Barnett paid Kelly a visit. Upon his arrival, he found Kelly in the company of a woman who was just about to leave. Unfortunately, there are conflicting accounts about who this woman was, when Barnett arrived, and how long he stayed. If we choose to believe Barnett, he arrived at some point between 7 and a quarter to 8 and left before 9 o'clock. Shortly before midnight, Kelly was spotted in the company of a man by her neighbor, Mary Ann Cox. When Cox passed the couple, they were about to enter Kelly's room. Cox bid Kelly goodnight, but she was, quote, very much intoxicated and barely able to respond. Once they had gone inside, Cox could hear Kelly singing. When Cox then left the court about an hour later, Kelly could still be heard singing. By 2 o'clock, Kelly had apparently ventured back outside, for she was spotted by a man named George Hutchinson. The two of them were supposedly well acquainted, and Kelly had asked if he could spare a few coins. But Hutchinson was broke, and Kelly was desperate for money, so they soon parted ways. Moments later, Hutchinson observed Kelly being accosted by a well-dressed man. The two of them had a seemingly jovial interaction and began walking north. Hutchinson found it suspicious that such a well-dressed man would seek the company of a woman like Kelly. As such, when the couple passed him by, he scrutinized the man's appearance. He was, for instance, carrying a pair of gloves in his right hand and a small parcel in his left. Hutchinson decided to shadow the couple as they proceeded to Miller's Court. Before they vanished up the court, the man handed Kelly a red handkerchief, and she had supposedly told him, "All right, my dear, come along, you will be comfortable." Hutchinson remained in the vicinity until 3 o'clock, but neither Kelly nor the man reappeared. At roughly the same time, Cox returned home. In stark contrast to the loud singing upon her last departure, Cox was now struck by the complete absence of sound and light from Kelly's room. Finally, at approximately 4 o'clock, a tenant above and a woman across from Kelly's room heard cries of murder. The voice was that of a woman, and it appeared to emanate from nearby. Meanwhile, other denizens of the court heard no screams at all. According to Dr. Bond, Kelly died between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning. Dr. Phillips placed the time of death a few hours later. But some witnesses were quite adamant that they had seen or even spoken to Kelly as late as 8 or 10 o'clock in the morning. Keep in mind that her body was discovered at a quarter to 11. These contradictions are difficult to reconcile, and the precise time of death eludes us to this day.
That is something that is very difficult for many investigations, is witness accounts. Because witness memories can't always be trusted. My memory, when it comes to being a witness, I hate to say it, but it probably shouldn't be trusted. That said, there are still plenty of things that I do remember. I still do remember I wouldn't even say fair, but a lot of what I learned in college, and even plenty that I researched on my own time during my college years and afterwards. When I'm very passionate about something, I tend to remember it a lot better. That's why, especially when it comes to various aspects of forensics, my fictional stories, my drawings, I remember a lot about them. When it comes to other things, plenty of social conversations, topics that I'm just not familiar with, some history-related stuff, I tend to not remember that quite as well. But my memory is just generally very shoddy, but it's not to say that it's impossible for me to remember something. Part of it, too, for me is that I just need a lot of repetition before I can commit it to memory. Or I need to be super passionate about it. And I am very passionate about stuff like this. And that's why I am fairly knowledgeable on things of this nature. And I hope it shows in both my voice, my tone, my body language that I do very much care about this. It is really cool stuff. At least to me, you know. It's still very dark and gruesome stuff, but it's still very fascinating to me nonetheless.
Mary Jane Kelly is typically regarded as the Ripper's final victim. Along with Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, and Catherine Eddowes, she is part of the Canonical Five.
Canonical
the five
Five,
victims
that's
most
what
likely
it is.
to have been slain by the same hand.
That's what the...
Martha Tabram might have been a victim of Jack the Ripper, but opinions are divided. The same is true of at least a handful of other cases.
I'm not sure where I stand. But yeah, there.
Even the Canonical Five are not without controversy, so the total number of victims is a matter of debate.
Always has been.
Presuming that Kelly was indeed the final victim, one has to wonder why. Why did the murders come to such a sudden end? Did a Ripper give in to fears of being caught? Were they imprisoned for a different crime? Perhaps they succumbed to an illness or committed suicide. Could they have migrated to another country? Perhaps they deliberately changed their modus operandi to confuse the police. The possibilities are virtually endless, which means there is no shortage of suspects.
I was about to say, yeah.
Following the murder of Mary Ann Nichols, a rumor began to circulate that someone called Leather Apron was in the habit of abusing prostitutes.
Yep.
The name quickly made its way into the press, and soon enough it became synonymous with the killer. In fact, Leather Apron was the predominant pseudonym before Jack the Ripper.
True.
But the man identified as Leather Apron was soon cleared of all suspicion. His real name was John Picer, and he was in a different part of London on the night when Nichols was attacked. This misguided manhunt is somewhat emblematic of the whole investigation. The police pursued even the most tenuous of leads due to a lack of evidence and mounting pressure from the public.
What else could
They
they
interviewed
do?
thousands, investigated hundreds, and developed numerous theories along the way. In the words of Inspector Frederick Abeline, "Theories. We were lost almost in theories. There were so many of them."
There still are to this day.
In an effort to narrow down the search, the police used a primitive form of criminal profiling. The idea was to analyze the available evidence to try and gauge what sort of person had committed the crimes. This profile was prepared by Dr. Thomas Bond, and he described the Ripper as a strong, middle-aged man with an inoffensive appearance who dressed respectably. Bond's most controversial assessment was that the killer possessed, quote, "no scientific nor anatomical knowledge."
I don't know about
This
that.
stood in direct opposition to the opinions of his peers, most of whom ascribed the Ripper with at least a basic understanding of anatomy. Based on the witness accounts, the Ripper was a man of average height with a medium to stout build in his late 20s to mid-30s. He wore dark clothes, including a hat of some sort, and had a mustache. But this sort of aggregation or tabulation of accounts can be quite deceptive. Not only are many details inconsistent, but they could be describing entirely different people. For all we know, none of the witnesses ever laid eyes on Jack the Ripper.
True.
So much is up for debate that one can build a case against almost any suspect. Some have even entertained the possibility that the Ripper was a woman or possibly a man disguised as a woman. While Jill or Jackie the Ripper is an interesting theory, it has failed to achieve any widespread support. What is rarely in dispute is that the Ripper was either a resident of or otherwise familiar with the East End. After all, he managed to narrowly evade capture on multiple occasions, which implies intimate knowledge of byways and patrol routes. He likely had some form of employment, as the murders were committed around weekends and public holidays, and he may have had some degree of anatomical knowledge. With this unshakable profile in hand, let's take a closer look at a few suspects. The question is,
That'll be fun.
where do we even begin?
Right. No, absolutely.
According to criminal profiler and FBI Special Agent John Douglas, The Ripper was not only a local, but was likely interviewed by the police. If Douglas is correct, the Ripper might be someone we've already met, either a witness or a person close to one of the victims. What about John Richardson, the witness in the Chapman case who sat down on the backyard steps to trim a piece of leather from his boot? Richardson was indeed suspected by the police, but they found, quote, not a shred of evidence against him. His mother also lived on the premises, so he had good reason to be there. What about George Hutchinson, the witness who followed Mary Jane Kelly after she was accosted by a well-dressed client? Hutchinson never clarified his motivation for shadowing the couple. He merely stated that he was surprised to see a man so well-dressed in the company of a woman like Kelly. Was he surprised because he was concerned? Was he jealous? Was it about money? After all, Hutchinson was broke and the client appeared to be wealthy. Perhaps he waited outside the court with the intention of mugging this well-dressed client. There are many question marks surrounding Hutchinson. He has never been positively identified, so next to nothing is known about his life. This makes it very difficult to build a strong case against him. Hutchinson was interrogated by the police, but ultimately convinced Inspector Frederick Abeline that he was telling the truth. But not every witness attracted such attention from the police. Take for instance Charles Cross, the man who discovered the body of Mary Ann Nichols.
Number 1.
On the morning of August the 31st, Charles Cross left his home on Doveton Street and headed for work. When he turned into Bucks Row, he happened upon the body of Mary Ann Nichols. Moments later, he was joined by Robert Paul, and events transpired as previously described.
Got it?
Despite his proximity to the crime, Cross appears to have escaped suspicion from both the press and the police. He was evidently seen as the innocent passerby that he appeared to be. But in recent years, that perception has been challenged. The argument is that Cross was in the act of committing the murder when he was interrupted by the approaching footsteps of Paul. Cross then concealed the murder weapon and portrayed himself as someone who just found the body. The injuries inflicted upon Nichols would be consistent with an interruption, as they were less severe than those of later victims.
Very true. Very.
What's interesting about Cross is that he likely testified under a false name. He claimed to be employed as a carman, and his address was given as 22 Doveton Street. But surviving records show that in 1888, this address was occupied by a man named Charles Lechmere. Lechmere was also employed as a carman, and on at least one occasion went by the name Charles Cross, as it was the surname of his stepfather. It is now widely believed that Charles Lechmere was the man who appeared at the inquest, and that he assumed the name of his stepfather when he testified. His motivation for doing so has been the source of much speculation. Was he trying to conceal his identity, or was it merely a force of habit? After all, contemporary examples of people doing the exact same thing are not difficult to find. The most compelling evidence against Lechmere is that his morning commute between home and work roughly coincides with the time and place of the murders. Except for the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, who were killed on a Sunday, the only day when Lechmere would have been free from work. Not only that, but all the murders were committed around weekends and public holidays. Why would a man who supposedly timed the murders with his morning commute gravitate towards days of rest? In any case, Lechmere's mother lived a few blocks south of Burness Street, the neighborhoods around which is also where Lechmere spent his childhood. As such, it's speculated that Stride and Eddowes were killed after Lechmere paid a late-night visit to his mother.
Interesting.
While he claimed to be employed at a delivery firm known as Pickford's, there are no surviving records of his employment. If he did work for Pickford's, there is a fair chance that he delivered meat and would thus have been exposed to slaughter and blood on a daily basis. LEMMiNO remained in East London until his death in 1920 at the age of 71. While there is no evidence of LEMMiNO ever being suspected by the police, it is difficult to believe that he was completely overlooked. Many case files have not survived, so any doubts investigators might have had could have long since disappeared. Now, a witness who definitely attracted attention was Joseph Barnett.
Suspect number 2. Hit me, let me know.
Joseph Barnett was the man who lived with Mary Jane Kelly up until a few days before the murder.
Oh,
He and Kelly had supposedly met around April of 1887, and they eventually moved to 13 Miller's Court. Barnett was employed as a fish porter, but for reasons unknown, he lost his job between July and August of 1888. From that point onwards, the couple struggled to pay rent, and Kelly resorted back to prostitution. Now, those who believe that Barnett was the Ripper view his loss of employment as a turning point. The argument is that Barnett was so overcome with guilt and anguish for driving Kelly back to prostitution that he went on a murder spree, murdering one local prostitute after another in a desperate attempt to frighten Kelly off the streets. While most of this is pure speculation, it is true that Barnett disapproved of Kelly's prostitution. You may recall that Barnett separated from Kelly on October the 30th because he disliked the prostitutes with whom she associated. Kelly never went on the streets when she lived with me. She would never have gone wrong again, and I should never have left if it had not been for the prostitutes stopping by the house. This might further explain why Kelly was the Ripper's final and most viciously mutilated victim, the implication being that Barnett felt rejected by Kelly and wanted revenge for the breakup.
Interesting.
According to Barnett, he did pay Kelly a visit on the evening of November the 8th, but they had parted on, quote, friendly terms. He then supposedly went home, played a card game until 12:30 before going to bed. Now, Kelly is presumed to have died in the early hours of November the 9th, so Barnett could have returned to Miller's Court sometime after midnight. While the police did subject him to 4 hours of interrogation, Barnett was ultimately released without charge. Then there's the matter of the locked door. When the police arrived at Miller's Court, they had to force the door open with a pickaxe. This raised an important question. How did the killer lock the door behind him? According to Barnett, the key to room 13 had been missing for some time. Because of this, he and Kelly would, quote, open the door by reaching through the broken window. The door was said to be equipped with a, quote, catch lock, and evidently locked itself upon being closed. If that's true, mystery solved. But even if the door was not self-locking, there's still an obvious solution. All the killer would have had to do is observe Kelly using the window trick and then employ that same technique to fasten the door upon leaving. But those who favor Barnett as the Ripper offer yet another solution. The key never went missing. Instead, Barnett is said to have stolen the key and then used it on the night of the murder. These solutions are all equally valid, and it's impossible to know which one is correct. There is a slight variation of this theory which states that Barnett did murder Kelly, but was not the Ripper. Instead, he merely emulated the Ripper to deflect attention away from himself. Once again, this is pure speculation, but the murder of Kelly did somewhat differ from the rest in that it was committed indoors. Barnett remained in the East End until his death in 1926 at the age of 68. While it's only natural for suspicion to fall upon witnesses and acquaintances, Victorian detectives did pursue other lines of inquiry. One prominent theory was that the Ripper suffered from insanity, and a prime suspect in that category is Aaron Kosminski.
Sounds vaguely familiar, but he hasn't mentioned it in this.
The Whitechapel murders investigation was overseen by numerous high-ranking officers within the Metropolitan Police. One of them was Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson. Upon his retirement, Anderson repeatedly and unequivocally stated that Jack the Ripper had been identified. There was no doubt whatever as to the identity of the criminal. Without disclosing the name of the suspect, Anderson described him as a, quote, low-class Polish Jew who was, quote, safely caged in an asylum. He'd been identified by a witness who was described as, quote, the only person who ever had a good view of the murderer. This unnamed witness had supposedly refused to testify because the suspect was, quote, a fellow Jew. I am almost tempted to disclose the identity of the murderer, but no public benefit would result from such a course. While Anderson never revealed the name of the suspect, his colleagues were a bit more forthcoming. Chief Inspector Donald Swanson revealed that his surname was Kosminski. Yet another high-ranking officer, Melville McNaughton, described Kosminski as a homicidal and misogynistic resident of Whitechapel. Surviving records show that an Aaron Kosminski was admitted to a psychiatric hospital in 1891. Aaron was indeed from Poland, he was Jewish, and had lived in Whitechapel. He suffered from auditory hallucinations and a paranoid fear of being fed by others. He was trained as a barber, but had, quote, not attempted any kind of work for years. It's unclear when his mental health began to decline, but upon being institutionalized, Aaron was deemed to be harmless. He was, quote, quiet and well-behaved, and, quote, apathetic as a rule. Only on rare occasions would he get, quote, excited and violent.
Interesting.
However, before his confinement, Aaron had once threatened his sister with a knife. The case against him largely hinges upon the claims made by Anderson, Swanson, and McNaughton, especially the claim that an unnamed witness identified a suspect named Kosminski. But the descriptions of that suspect are not entirely consistent with Aaron Kosminski. For instance, McNaughton stated that the suspect had been, quote, removed to a lunatic asylum about March 1889. Aaron was first confined in 1891. Swanson wrote that the suspect had been, quote, sent to the asylum and died shortly afterwards. Aaron was still alive at the time and spent nearly 3 decades in psychiatric care. As such, it is possible that the suspect Kosminski was someone other than Aaron Kosminski. It's also possible that these inconsistencies were mere lapses in memory. After all, these events were recounted years or even decades after the fact, and McNaughton even confessed to writing solely from memory. Regardless of the suspect's true identity, Anderson was the only one who seemed convinced of his guilt. McNaughton ultimately favored a different suspect and stated that, quote, many homicidal maniacs were suspected, but no shadow of proof could be thrown on any one. Inspector Edmund Reed was of the same opinion. Now we have Sir Robert Anderson saying that Jack the Ripper was a Jew. That I challenge him to prove. I challenge anyone to prove that there was a tittle of evidence against man, woman, or child. So when Anderson wrote that there was, quote, no doubt whatever as to the identity of the criminal, he merely expressed his personal opinion. There was in fact ample doubt and no consensus amongst the police.
Nicely done.
But in recent years, Aaron Kosminski has been resurrected as a prime suspect due to a controversial DNA analysis. Okay, so back in 1888, Acting Sergeant Amos Simpson is said to have stolen a blood-stained shawl from the crime scene of Catherine Eddowes. This shawl was then passed down from one generation to the next before being submitted for DNA testing in 2011. DNA samples were extracted from the shawl and then compared against maternal descendants of Eddowes and Kosminski. In both cases, it was a match. If the subsequent news coverage is to be believed, the mystery has now been, quote, definitively solved. Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper. But as you can imagine, it's never quite that simple.
No, it's not.
First of all, the provenance or chain of custody of the shawl is severely lacking. There is no evidence of a shawl being found at the crime scene, nor is there any evidence of Simpson ever being at the crime scene. Furthermore, a destitute woman like Eddowes is unlikely to have owned such an expensive item. Second of all, the type of DNA used to identify Eddowes and Kosminski was mitochondrial DNA, the powerhouse of the cell. This type of DNA is passed down through the female line and is not unique to any one individual. Thousands can share the same mitochondrial DNA, which means it can't be used to pinpoint a specific person.
No.
In the words of a geneticist, Based on mitochondrial DNA, one can only exclude a suspect. So to say that the mystery has been definitively solved is widely inaccurate.
No.
There's still plenty of room for doubt. So to recap, a suspect named Kosminski was identified by an unknown witness. This was enough to convince at least one senior officer of his guilt. That suspect may have been Aaron Kosminski, a man who was largely non-violent but once threatened his sister with a knife. Aaron can neither be incriminated nor eliminated by the DNA evidence. He spent the rest of his life in psychiatric care and died in 1919 at the age of 53.
That's all
Kosminski was not the only suspect advanced by a high-ranking officer. A completely different suspect who still falls into the same category is Francis Tumblety.
That's a name. Tumblety. Oh, he actually gets his own section.
2 days before the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, an American physician named Francis Tumblety was arrested in London. As you can probably tell from this photograph, Tumblety was quite an eccentric character. He was born in Ireland around 1833, but was raised in the United States. From an early age, Tumblety gained a reputation for being a medicaster or quack doctor. He engaged in all sorts of medically dubious practices and advertised himself as the Indian herb doctor. He promised to cure anything from dyspepsia and scurvy to cancer and blindness using nothing but medicinal herbs. When he was not posing as a doctor, Tumblety was busy running from the law. He was either accused or convicted for crimes like theft and assault, attempt to induce a miscarriage, and manslaughter of a patient. He was even implicated in the assassination of US President Abraham Lincoln, but was ultimately cleared of suspicion.
Damn.
Now, in the early 1860s, Tumblety is alleged to have hosted a lavish dinner party in Washington. Only men were invited to this dinner, and Tumblety had supposedly expressed fierce hatred of women. Furthermore, he showcased a cabinet in his office in which he stored a vast collection of jars filled with anatomical specimens.
I'm sorry, Mama. My bad, my bad. Hey, come here. You're okay, Mama. I'm sorry.
Furthermore, he showcased a cabinet in his office in which he stored a vast collection of jars filled with anatomical specimens, some of which were said to contain the wombs of, quote, every class of woman.
Jeez.
In 1869, Tumblety ventured across the Atlantic and visited England for the first time. By his own admission, he roamed the streets of London until he became familiar with every part of it. He advertised himself as the great American doctor and had a few skirmishes with the police. After a few more voyages between the old world and the new, Tumblety found himself in London in the autumn of 1888. The purpose of his visit and whereabouts at the time of the murders are completely unknown. Tumblety never stayed in one place for long and made frequent use of false names. There is a story of a mysterious lodger leaving behind a blood-stained shirt near the murder site of Elizabeth Stride. This supposedly happened on the night of the murder, and some believe that this lodger was Francis Tumblety. But there is no firm evidence of that, and the entire incident is fraught with uncertainty. What we do know is that Tumblety was arrested in London on November the 7th. According to the press, as well as Tumblety himself, he was arrested on suspicion of being Jack the Ripper. 2 days later, Mary Jane Kelly was found brutally murdered, and it's unclear whether Tumblety was still in custody or had already been released on bail. Nevertheless, he was ultimately charged with 4 counts of gross indecency, which had nothing to do with the murders. But Tumblety had no intention of standing trial. Instead, he made his way across the English Channel, boarded a steamship under a false name, and fled back to America. He was pursued by detectives and kept under surveillance, but his offenses were, quote, not extraditable. As such, Tumblety remained in the United States and never returned to England.
Well then.
So to recap,
Sounds like a
Francis
lunatic.
Tumblety was a misogynistic medicaster who was in London at the time of the murders. He even showcased a collection of wombs, and the Ripper did indeed extract the womb from 2 of his victims. I mean, he sounds like the perfect suspect. Perhaps a bit too perfect. There is no doubt that
Don't know
Tom
about
Letty
that.
was in London in 1888,
I
but the claim that he was a
No.
misogynistic collector of human body parts is extremely dubious. It can be traced back to a single article from December of 1888 featuring an interview with a man named Charles Dunham. Dunham had a long history of spreading misinformation and has been described as a pathological liar, a forger, and a conman. He was even convicted of perjury. As such,
Jeez.
there is every reason to believe that this story is a complete fabrication. Furthermore, Tom Letty was both older and taller than the men described by most witnesses. Tom Letty was said to be, quote, an enormous man who liked to dress in flamboyant and militaristic outfits. It's difficult to imagine a tall, pompous American sneaking around the streets of Whitechapel virtually undetected. On the other hand,
yeah.
it's unclear which, if any, of the witness accounts can be trusted. Then there's the matter of the rings. You may recall that 2 brass rings were stolen from the body of Annie Chapman.
Way back.
It's suspected that the rings were taken by the Ripper to be kept as trophies. Now, upon his death in 1903, Tom Letty left behind a quite impressive estate. But among his many valuable possessions were a pair of inexpensive imitation rings. Could they have been the same rings taken from the body of Chapman? It's possible. It's also impossible to prove.
Accurate.
Chief Inspector John Littlechild regarded Tom Letty as a, quote, very likely suspect. And it's not difficult to see why. If the many rumors about him are to be believed, Tom Letty had both opportunity and motive to commit the murders. But therein lies the problem. Much of what we know about Tom Letty is founded upon unsubstantiated rumors.
Right.
Tom Letty himself was an attention-seeking charlatan with no qualms about lies and deception. With a suspect like that, one can never be certain where the lies end and the truth begins.
Fair.
To theorize about the identity of Jack the Ripper is to navigate a minefield of hearsay, sophistry, and contradictions. Entire encyclopedias have been dedicated to the compilation of suspects, and with every passing year, they seem to grow ever more expansive.
Oh yeah.
Even though there are hundreds of potential suspects, only a dozen or so are worth more than a brief consideration. Some of the more sensational contenders include famous authors and artists, as well as high-ranking officers and members of the royal family. But these grand conspiracies and elaborate deceptions seem hopelessly contrived against the sheer simplicity of a suspect like Charles Lechmere, an unassuming delivery man on his way to work. Personally, I remain unconvinced that Jack the Ripper has even been identified as a suspect. The few covered in this video are probable candidates, but it's still possible to make persuasive arguments against them. The same is true of all those left out by necessity. None of them can offer anything more than ambiguity and circumstance.
Yep.
With a suspect pool in the hundreds, that might seem improbable. But London was the largest city in the world, home to the largest port in the world. It was a city of millions, with a large population of poorly documented drifters. It's not difficult to imagine one lowly sailor, butcher, medic, soldier, barber, merchant, porter, clerk, blending into the slums of Whitechapel
I see what you did there.
like a grain of sand.
These patrons gotta get a shout out. Ooh, yeah, sketches. Yeah, sketches of... Okay. Wow. Despite the tone of, you know, the entire episode, this is some very tranquil music. Man, it is crazy how many patrons LEMMiNO has. This was a very well put together video. makes sense that it's a little over an hour long. I have to yawn. I'm not used to talking so much in a short period of time. That was a really good video. I'm glad that people suggested Jack the Ripper to me. I mean, I was already kind of looking at it a little bit because, you know, it's a forensic mystery. How could I not? Once again, LEMMiNO has really done his research and put a lot of thought and effort into this. Again, through all the fantastic visuals and audio cues. It was very pleasant to look at and very pleasant to listen to, and I appreciate how calm and deliberate he is with all of this information. Because there is a lot of information to grasp about this, undoubtedly. Granted, a lot of this was new, because there are only some cases where I study a lot of the intimate details of certain cases, and then many others where I just know a few points, some general basics. I would say kind of like I did with the Jack the Ripper case. The Dyatlov Pass case, I was a little bit more familiar with the intimate details of, but there was a lot more that I was unfamiliar with. Whereas the search for DB Cooper, I did not know quite as much. I knew little bits and pieces, not as much as I was familiar with when it came to Jack the Ripper, at least. And of course, I do enjoy going on some of my forensic ramblings. I noticed I was doing a bunch of those in the first third-ish segment of the video. I was doing it a little bit less over time, but that was kind of focusing more on the suspects and the law enforcement side of it, which, you know, I know a thing here or two, but I am much more familiar with the science aspect of it, and even to an extent the history aspect, but just to a small extent. So yeah, after thinking about it, I'm wondering if that Mary Jane Kelly killing, because of the nature of it, it's possible that that one could even be excluded from the canonical 5. That's what they are called. It almost seemed like that was more killing of passion than it was purpose, if that makes any sense. LEMMiNO made an absolutely good point, though, that even the canonical 5, we don't know for sure if they were Jack the Ripper killings. For all we know, Jack the Ripper never even existed. I feel like there's enough evidence to point to the fact that there was a serial killer, and then at least 4 of the canonical 5. I'm starting to question and doubt the Mary Jane Kelly killing now, but at least 4 of those I am sure are the same individual. Well, actually, probably 3 for sure, because there was the double event, and theoretically, based on the distance and the timing of everything, that would be crazy if those 2 murders on the same night were the same person and they both got a little cut short due to outside circumstances. That would be, well, in its own tragic way, kind of amusing. So, all 5 of them could have been victims, only 3 or 4 of them could have been. Heck, there could even be more victims that were never noted, or maybe their murders were cut short enough that people wouldn't even have thought of them as being Jack the Ripper victims. He could have had as few as 2 or 3 victims, and as many as maybe 10 or 15. We don't really know for sure, but it is by far one of the most fascinating cold cases out there. For some reason, I thought it happened at some point earlier in time. Hello, Mama. 1880s. Yeah, that's, thank you. Thank you for that. That was a very, very good video. LEMMiNO's craft has significantly improved from both Dyatlov Pass case mystery as well as the search for DB Cooper. I noticed that he had really stepped up in his craft in the DB Cooper video, and he's definitely shot even further beyond that with this particular video. The visuals and the animation alone are so noteworthy. Of course, you know, you have some of the audio and the background music as well, and his way of storytelling is, I like it. It's very calm and collected and deliberate. It's the best way for me to explain it, I think. but I really enjoy the way he tells these stories and he shares the facts and the information and shows off all of this research he's done. I'm willing to bet that he probably had a script, and he probably had a bunch of scripts, and it probably had to get cut down to a fourth or a third, if not more, of what it originally was. Because again, if you look at this timetable, that's an hour and 7-8 minutes. That's a long video, and he does a lot of this on his own, if not all of it on his own. All the research, the image searching, the animation, the audio, the editing, everything. In which case, I commend him. I do not have the skill to be able to put together something like this. I do kind of wish I did, because then I might be able to do some more forensic and science videos, some cooler art videos even, maybe even some game videos too, but I just don't have the level of skill and expertise. I don't. I can do basic things when it comes to editing. I've certainly been able to do more, and I've been able to do it more efficiently as well. But I could not do what LEMMiNO does. I would need to take classes to try and learn this. This is beyond me in terms of how you put this together. But I digress. That is the end of my little rant. Thank you to everybody who suggested that I watch this video. I need to watch some other science videos. I'm actually kind of looking at a Grad. I can't say that channel name right ever, but I am looking into that channel, probably some more of LEMMiNO's content, maybe some other similar material. I would love to stick around a lot of the forensics, and not even the basic forensics, but I still love things related to, you know, zoology, geology, entomology, even some physics and chemistry. Not just the basic, you know, photography, bloodstains, not the basic forensic stuff, although I could do that as well. But even some of the stuff beyond that general scope of what people usually see when they think of forensics. So I am trying to branch out a little bit with that kind of content. And if you guys have suggestions, I am open. I mean, clearly you've already suggested some great videos to me already, so thank you, LEMMiNO, so much for making this video, and I hope you guys enjoyed this reaction and commentary and analysis from me, being a forensic science major. And as usual, until the next video, guys, check you laters.